Dr. Michelle here, and I'm so excited to be able to share with you all about making yeast the natural way. Now, I'll just tell you right now, the screen behind me looks really weird, especially when I move like this, because it's a virtual screen. It means I figured out, it means I can do a webinar anywhere. I can have horribly messy room behind me. I actually don't, but and nobody would know. So I'm sorry if it looks a little odd, but that's the way we're going to be doing it. I just got done with a 6-hour webinar teaching 175 dentists and their team today all about ozone and the way to do it in their dental offices to keep everybody safe after this COVID pandemic is past. We're back to work and lots of good things going on. But now we got to talk about bread, and I'm really excited to do this. It's been interesting. We've been making so much bread around here because I'm home and I'm able to do that, but also because I've been practicing for this class. And so we have figured out all sorts of good recipes and things to use. And I'll tell you how to get all that at the end. But let's just start now with why in the world were we even talking about this? So that's where we're going to begin. It's interesting. Grains are very interesting. They really have been the center or the basis of civilization since the beginning of recorded time. I've done a lot of research on this and have found that they think it was probably Egyptians who really started making bread, but it was years before that, even when people started living in civilizations, living together, that they were domesticating crops and growing things and not having to just follow herds for their food all the time. Grains have been the basis of the calories and the nutrition for civilizations from the beginning of time up till today. So the wheat actually occupies the most land growing space in the world of any other grain right now, but wheat, rice, and corn pretty much dominate and provide most of the calories for people throughout the world. As I was doing research, I found that some of the earliest coins had grain on the front of the coin. And then I remembered that they would use measures of grain as measuring amounts. So a senum of barley, or, these things were the way that they measured other things by. So grains have been a big part of civilization in a lot of different ways. We talk about, could we go without eating grains? The keto diet and some of these popular diets want us to leave these grains out of our diet. Well, for me, it's hard to think that it would be okay for everyone to eat them up to this day and age. So I tend to think it's more about the way we prepare them and more about the way we eat them than actually eating them. That's what we're going to really center on for a little while here, is talking about how do we prepare these grains and how can we make them so they're exactly what people have used them for forever. Nutritious, good calories, not just empty calories, and really good for us, as well as delicious, right? So there is a problem with grains, but it really goes along with some of the advantages of grains. So some of the reason that grains have been such a center point of food and diet and community for so many years is that they are so easy to store. Again, talking about Egyptians, they've found wheat seeds, wheat kernels in Egyptian tombs that they've then planted centuries later, and they still grow. That's pretty miraculous, honestly. And as you look at this picture, you can see, and if you've ever looked at a seed or a grain seed, there's a hard coating on the outside of that seed. It's dry, and it allows that seed to be stored for a long period of time, that seed or that grain. Each grain is just a seed, right? We could plant it and it would grow another plant. It allows that seed to be stored for a long time. Well, once that seed is put in a wet, moist, often cool environment, it will sprout, right? It will sprout and it will grow a new plant. So when we use the grain without providing that sort of an environment, it's actually very difficult for our body to digest. On the outside of that seed it's called an anti-nutrient called phytic acid. And what it does is it allows all of the nutrition inside of that seed to be locked up inside of it, so that as soon as it gets watered, moist, wet, damp, dark inside of the soil, it will release all that nutrition, and all of a sudden the seed will sprout and turn into a plant. But as long as that phytic acid is on the outside of the seed, it will stay dormant and the nutrition is locked up inside. So if we just grind up that wheat or that whatever grain it might be, and we don't do away with or provide an environment to do away with that phytic acid or that anti-nutrient, the nutrients are still locked up inside of that grain and not available to our system. The interesting thing too is there's been research that's shown that not only does it affect the nutrition coming from the food you've made. So let's say you made a piece of bread and you made it without doing the processes we're going to talk about in a few minutes. You made it without that. You just ground up the wheat, turned it into flour, turned it into a loaf of bread. Well, you're not going to get the nutrition out of that wheat that you would have if you had done what we're going to talk about, but you also won't get the nutrition out of the food you eat along with that bread. So let's say you had a great big salad along with that piece of bread. The nutrition in that salad is also going to be inhibited by that anti-nutrient on the outside of that grain. Isn't that interesting? So not only does it lock up the nutrients inside the grain, it locks up the nutrients coming from the other food that you ingest along with that grain. You know, Americans have been called the most overfed, undernourished country in pretty much history, all history. Why is that? What's going on? Why are we overfed but undernourished? I think grains are a huge part of it because grains are such a staple in everyone's diet. But if you think about it, grains are typically used in things like processed cereals. There's a multiple problems in actually processed cereals. The processed cereals, processed grain products that have not been treated this way, even things like granolas that haven't been treated this way, all the nutrients are locked up. So they're providing calories, but they're not providing nutrition that goes along with it. And, you know, I've talked a lot about this thing called an apostat. I learned about it years ago. I love this concept and it makes a lot of sense. That in our bodies, we actually have this, it's like a thermostat, but it's for your appetite. And the thermostat says, I'm hungry. Really what it's saying, or this apostat, what it's saying is, I need nutrition. I need nutrients. I need fuel right now. So you go to the fridge, go to whatever, and you get fuel. If you eat something that provides calories, but not actual nutrients, your body still says, I'm hungry. You have not fed me the nutrients that I need. You've not given me the fuel I need. You've given me calories, but you've not given me nutrients. So it stays hungry, and you eat and you eat and you eat and you eat. So the problem with a lot of the processed grain products that really dominate the American diet is that they provide calories, but not nutrients. So we stay hungry, we continue eating, and we become overweight and undernourished. So we're going to learn how to not do that anymore, which is, it's actually very, very simple, and I'm excited about it. Not only does that grain have the nutrients locked up, but the proteins in that grain, one that we all know about now, which is called gluten, right? I mean, how much have we heard about gluten? Who even knew what gluten was before? You know, hardly ever. But now everybody knows about gluten. What that is, gluten is simply a protein that's in the plant. And gluten, that protein itself is actually a fairly complex protein. So it's difficult to break it down. The way our body deals with protein is it breaks them apart into individual amino acids. That's what a protein is. It's just a whole bunch of amino acids pushed together. And it breaks it apart. That's how our body utilizes those amino acids. It needs those things to be able to have good nutrition. That's again fuel. Well, sometimes it's difficult to break apart that gluten. It's big, it's complex, and especially if our stomachs aren't working as well as they should, which mine apparently hasn't been since I was at least late teens, early 20s, because I've had issues like this for a long time. I've not been able to break down those gluten proteins. I didn't know what it was for years, but I've learned it's somewhat to do with my digestive system, but somewhat to do with the fact that the gluten proteins haven't been handled in the way we're going to describe. So I can now eat the bread I make this way. It's fabulous. I'm perhaps eating a little more of this bread than I should, but it's really delicious and I can eat it and I don't feel bad. So the things we're going to teach are going to teach you how to unlock the nutrients inside of the grain, how to pre-digest those difficult to digest proteins like gluten, and how to pre-digest some of the simple sugars as well. Because you've probably heard of like glycemic index and blood sugar spikes and those kinds of things from grains. Well, when all you're eating is a simple sugar, your blood sugar is going to spike, your insulin's going to get it all thrown off, and that's what often leads to type 2 diabetes. So it's going to handle that as well. It's going to handle that blood sugar spike when these processes that I'm going to teach help to pre-digest those simple sugars. Now, our ancestors knew what they were doing. They have been fermenting these grains for forever. It's interesting, as I've been really researching this, I've found that pretty much every civilization, every society had some version of a fermented grain food. So some of these that are on the screen, there's Indian dosas. Those are a fermented grain, kind of like a crepe that they make. The center one, this is an African pudding that they make with a fermented grain. You know all about the chuck wagon, American pioneers. They all had their sourdoughs. This is sourdough biscuits up here. On the bottom is a corn cake that's made in Mexico. They make a fermented corn cake called pozole. So it's really interesting to see. And at first I thought, I bet they do it just because they don't have preservation. Okay, they have to ferment because they don't have a refrigerator, so they have to just let it sit out. But I don't think that's the case. I think our ancestors knew, because of the way their bodies functioned, that when they fermented things like this, they digested better and they were healthier. And they could see it through generations. They could see it. These foods also taste quite delicious. So I think that that's also part of why they did it. Science has just catching up now with what our ancestors have been doing for centuries. I was going to say decades, but it's centuries actually, what they've been doing for centuries. So we forgot what we were doing, and we thought that was all just wives' tales, old things that people did. We don't need to do that now because we're so advanced. Well, what we're learning is that a lot of what they did was much better for us than what we're doing now, and so we need to go back and learn from them a bit. All right, where do we get these yeasts? So that's what you're going to be using when we're doing a yeasted bread like we want to be having. We need to get a natural yeast. That natural yeast is going to do all of the work. It's going to pre-digest the simple sugars. It's going to pre-digest those difficult to digest proteins like gluten. It's going to allow those anti-nutrients to release the nutrition. It's going to do all those things. Yeast is really a workhorse for us. Where do we find them? Yeasts are actually everywhere. This is how they make beer. This is how they make wine. This is how they make all those things that are fermented that way. This is how we make a lot of fermented foods. They are on every bit of grain that you've ever used in your life. It's going to have a natural yeast on it already. If you've ever looked at grapes, that kind of that whitish coating on the outside, that's a natural yeast. That's why grapes are beautiful for wine, because they have a natural yeast already on the outside. So there's a lot of yeasts everywhere. They're in the air. They're everywhere around us. When we use them in the proper way, it helps to raise the breads that we're going to be making. It helps to break down the sugars, and it breaks down the proteins. It's interesting. I've been learning about how yeast raises bread. So it doesn't matter if it's these wild yeasts, if it's the commercial yeasts that we'll talk about in a minute. It's all the same process. What it does is as the bread is forming, it will form strands of these proteins, this gluten protein. It will actually form strands. Well, as the yeast is digesting, or literally eating, the simple sugars in the flour, it creates gas, carbon dioxide gas. Well, that carbon dioxide gas lifts those sheets of protein or gluten up, kind of like a hot air balloon, and that's where you get the leavening or the lift in a bread loaf, is from the yeast digesting the simple sugars in the flour, causing carbon dioxide gas to get trapped underneath those protein layers, and it lifts up and makes those bubbles. So I'm kind of a nerd. I things like that just stick in my head. I just thought that was kind of interesting that that's how it worked. So why don't we do these things anymore? Actually, this was invented or kind of discovered in the late 1800s, but really it kicked in the early 1900s, 1920, 1930. Really, these commercial yeasts became available to bakers everywhere. And then rapid rise yeast came onto the market in 50s, 60s, somewhere in there, and made bread baking so much easier, so much shorter, so much simpler, all those kinds of things. So this is an isolated strain of yeast that has certain properties that basically allows it to rise very, very quickly. Unfortunately, because it rises quickly, it doesn't allow the yeast to do all of the jobs that the yeast needs to do. It doesn't give it enough time to pre-digest those gluten proteins. It doesn't give it enough time to pre-digest the simple sugars. It doesn't give it enough time to release the nutrients in those grains. It doesn't give it enough time to do all those things, because those processes take time. So why do we use this yeast? Because it's so much more convenient than the process I'm going to teach you here. It's so much faster. However, it's so much less nutritious. Now, we've gotten away with it a little bit in our diets because we have a really diverse diet in our world today. I can go to the grocery store, even in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, I can go to the grocery store today and I can buy a wide range of foods that have nutrients in them. I can buy a wide range of fruits and vegetables and, whatever it might be that have a lot of nutrients in it. A lot of societies were very limited in what they had. And so they could not risk not getting the nutrients out of their grains. They required the nutrients in those grains. We can kind of get away with it, but not really, because that's where that obesity problem comes back in. Again, we're overeating and undernourishing ourselves. So we can get nourishment elsewhere, but we're losing out on it here. We're missing out on the nourishment that we could get from the grains if we handled them in a natural yeast process. So that's really why those were used, convenience sake. Unfortunately, sacrifice nutrition and health benefits for it. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of what we do and how we do it. First of all, you need what's called a starter. All a starter is flour and water and those wild yeasts. So just like those little packages of yeasts, they had captured a yeast and they had bred that certain strain. Well, you're going to capture yeast as well. You're going to capture it in that starter. Now, the starter is also going to get yeasts. Every single time you add flour, it's going to get a yeast from that. Every time you open the lid up and, put it out into your kitchen, it's going to get yeasts from your kitchen. So it's going to get different strains of yeast, but you're going to get a primary strain of yeast that came from whatever you created the starter with, also from your environment. So it's interesting. People talk about, like, a really famous sourdough bread is San Francisco sourdough bread. And so you can get a San Francisco sourdough starter. However, if I'm using a San Francisco sourdough starter here in Utah, I am not going to have the same yeasts in my bread as they have in San Francisco, even if I use their starter, because the yeasts come from your environment less than they do from your starter. So you're going to get a starter from somewhere, from something, and it's going to have certain strains of yeast, but it's going to eventually evolve into your strains, your starter, your thing based on what's most effective, grows best in your environment. So where do you get that starter? You can get it from a friend, from a family member. You can get it online. You can get it at a health food store. You can get it in a dried form. I just had somebody email me today that has a dried form that you can get in packages. And I actually will teach you how to reactivate those. You can get them in all those different ways, or you can make your own. So how do you make your own? Again, yeasts are everywhere. So if you just mix together flour and water, and if you use rye flour, it actually works faster. But for me, I kind of like to just do it with whatever I'm going to be making my bread with. So if you're going to be making wheat flour bread, then I say just try it with wheat flour. You're going to stir that 3 times a day. The aeration activates the yeasts in there. So you're going to want to give it a lot of oxygen, a lot of food. You're going to stir it. After a couple of days, you're going to pour off about half of that and then add flour and water again. Remember, the flour is the food. You want to feed these yeasts, and then you're going to stir it up, give it a lot of oxygen. After 3 or 4 days, you're going to start to see it get bubbly. It may even start to get a little bit of a yeasty smell. That's what you want. Again, you're going to pour off some of it. You're going to add yeast and water, flour and water back in, stir it up. So after a week and a half or so, you're going to have a decent bubbly starter. It's going to be less predictable making it this way than if you get it from someone else that has an established starter, but it's absolutely doable. So you don't need to go get a starter to be able to start doing this. You can just literally tonight go mix some flour and water together in a jar. I love to do it in a canning jar, just a quart size mason jar. You do want a lid on it. I use a plastic canning lid rather than the metal lid because the metal does get nasty after a while. You could also put on a metal ring with a bit of cheesecloth or like a tea towel, something like that. A lot of times I'll reuse things. So I'll use an old t-shirt, cut a ring out of it, something like that. You can use that as well, but you do want it to be covered. So you can make your own. If you get one of those powdered ones that come from the online source or in the mail, somewhere like that, what you do is very, very similar. You're going to add flour and water, equal proportions. So like a 1/4 cup of each to those dried flakes, about a tablespoon of the dried flakes, mix it up. You're going to do quite similar things. You're going to, every couple of days, you're going to mix it 2 or 3 times a day. After a couple of days, it'll get a little bubbly, pour a little off, add some more flour or water. I'll tell you in a minute why we pour a little off. add some flour and water, and then you're going to reactivate that. Same thing happens if you have a starter that you think has gone dormant in the fridge because you've left it for so long. Basically what happens if you've left a starter for a long time in the fridge, and I've done this so I know, is you're going to get kind of a brown liquid on the top. That's alcohol. It's actually the byproduct of the yeast eating the sugars, but it tells you that the yeast has pretty much eaten all the food in sight. It's eaten everything. So you're going to pour off the brown liquid on top. You're going to remove most of the starter out of that jar. Then you're going to add flour and water in equal proportions, stir it up. The exact same thing. You're going to use the exact same method to reactivate a starter that you feel like you've killed. Have you killed it? It's rare that you've actually killed it. It most likely is just really hungry because it's all out of food. And once you feed it, you're going to be able to reactivate it again. If you killed it, oh well. Mix some flour and water together in a bowl or in a jar on your countertop, start stirring it. In another week, you've got another starter. So there is no mystery. People are always so like, oh, I don't know how to do that. It's really complicated. There's no mystery. It's just flour, which is the food, water, which makes it moist, and the yeasts that come from the air. So that's all a starter is. How do you feed your starter? Okay, so we do need to talk about why we're going to pour off some of it. Remember, the flour is the food. So if you have a lot of starter still left in your jar when you're going to feed it, the trouble is you're going to put flour in there, but you have a lot of yeast that need the food. They're going to compete for the food, and they're not going to get very much. Each of the yeasts aren't going to get very much food. So it actually works much better if you pour off or get, I'm not going to say get rid of, if you take out the majority of the starters. So if we're talking a quart size canning jar that you keep your starter in, I want you to keep a 1/2 inch to 1 inch max of starter in the bottom of that jar. That's all I want you to keep. 1/2 inch is even better. Sometimes I barely even have what's left on the jar because I've used up all the starter in a recipe. So you don't want much. That's all you need. Then you're going to add flour and water in equal proportions. So let's walk through what I have on the screen here. Let's say that you have 3 cups starter left in your jar, okay? You fed it like 3 days ago, you have 3 cups starter left. You're gonna remove 2.5 cups of that starter. You're gonna save it. I'm gonna tell you what to do with it in a little while, but you're gonna save that starter. Don't get rid of it unless you really seriously don't wanna make anything else with it, but I'll tell you a really simple thing to always make with it. Take 2.5 cups out or more, you know, leave a 1/4 cup in there. Then you're gonna add 1.5 cups of flour, 1.25 cups of water, just slightly less water. An easy way to do it is, let's say you're doing 1 cup and 1 cup. You do a rounded cup full of flour and an equal, you can't really do a rounded cupful of water because it'll spill out. So you do a cupful of water and then a heaping cupful of flour. That means you're getting a little more flour than water. You're going to mix it in. Remember, aeration feeds the yeast with oxygen. You're going to aerate it, stir up really good, and then you're going to put a lid on it. If you're going to use that starter, so let's just kind of walk through a scenario here. Let's say tomorrow morning I wake up and I say, you know what? I think I'm going to make some bread today. So that means I'm going to take my starter out of the fridge. It's going to be dormant. Then my starter is in the fridge right now, actually. So it's going to be dormant. It's not going to be really active. I could use that starter in bread. However, it's not going to give me a great result because those yeasts they're kind of hungry. They don't have a lot of food going on still in there. So that's not going to give me a great result. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out, like we're going to use this example, I'm going to take out 2.5 cups of that. I'm going to put that in another container, and in just a moment, I'm going to tell you what to do with that. I'm going to put that in another container. I'm going to add flour and water, 1 cup of water, heaping cup full of flour. I'm going to stir it up really good, and I'm going to let it sit out on my counter, room temperature, with a lid on. Be careful, because sometimes I'll get yeast volcano, so I always put a small plate underneath just to catch the volcano if it happens. I'm going to put a lid on, and in 4 to 6 hours, that starter is going to be happy and bubbly and frothy and ready to go into your bread. We'll talk in a minute about how to put it in the bread, but that's how you feed your starter. So every time you're wanting to use it in a raised bread, you're going to want to feed it before you add it to your recipe. Now, what are you going to do with that starter that you removed out of the jar? That's still great stuff. In fact, that starter all by itself is wonderful pre-digested gluten containing material. And so sometimes if I just need, let's say a flatbread for dinner that night, all I'll do is I'll take that starter that I removed, I'll mix in a little bit of olive oil, maybe some spices, maybe some Italian spices, some salt, and I will just pour that out. It's like a thick pancake. Sorry, I forgot to say that. The consistency of this starter is going to be like a thick pancake mix. So one where, you know, you pour the pancake in, it doesn't just spread out all over the griddle. It kind of holds its shape. That's the consistency you want for your starter. So again, that's what my starter is. That's the starter I removed. So I'm going to, you know, mix in a couple of things, pour it out on my griddle, flip it over. I've now got a flatbread for dinner. I mean, it's that simple. But what I often will do is I'll take that starter out and I'll put it in a glass measuring cup. Ideally, you keep starter in glass because it is reactive against metal. It is slightly acidic. And so the acid will actually eat the metal on the band on the canning jar. That's why I use a plastic one. It'll eat metal in a container you put it in. You really want to keep it in plastic. And I try to stir it, always stir it with wood, with a wooden spoon. So you're going to put it in a glass measuring jar, glass bowl, whatever you want. And what I do to that is I add some flour and water. So I'm in essence feeding that part of my starter as well over there in the other container. I'm going to add some flour and water. I'm going to put a tea towel over it, and I'm going to leave it all day long and all night long. Sorry. The next morning I wake up and I'm going to add some simple ingredients, and I will give you some of these recipes. I'll tell you how to get all these recipes, but you add an egg, some olive oil, a little bit of salt, and now it's pancake mix. So then you use it for pancakes in the morning. And so you did not waste the starter that you had. It became pancakes, or you add a little oatmeal to that, and now it becomes waffles. Or there's all sorts of uses for that extra starter that you're not going to use when you feed your starter for your bread. That extra starter is not going to be as useful for your bread. Remember, it's not going to be as active, but it's useful for all sorts of things. And we've just come up with all sorts of things to use that for, because I hate to throw anything away. So I would never throw it away. We always turn it into something delicious. So that's how you're going to feed your starter. Let it sit for 4 to 12 hours. And if your starter has been neglected for a little while, if it's newer, it might take 12 hours for it to really get active. But mine is usually a good 4 hours, and it's already turning into a volcano. So I have to be prepared for it. But I feed it a lot. I use it a lot. So it's pretty active. If you're not going to use it very often, once a week maybe, then it may take you a little longer to activate it. So the key to this natural yeast bread is just think ahead. It's just to think ahead. And sometimes that's hard in our fast world. Although, you know, this whole pandemic thing's been kind of nice. Honestly, it's given us the opportunity to be home a little bit more myself. I'm talking about myself here. And so I can plan ahead a little bit more and go, yeah, I want bread tomorrow. All right, let's get started on feeding it this morning. So how often do you feed your starter? You know, it's how often you want to use it. Last week, we were using it every single day. So we fed it every single day, and boy, was it happy by the end of the week. I couldn't even leave it 2 hours before it was a volcano coming out of my starter jar, because it was so happy and so well fed. But every 3 to 4 days or so, like I said, remove a little before you're feeding. If you longer, keep it in your fridge. So if you're not going to use it the next day, or that same day, then keep it in your fridge. Pour off the dark liquid like I talk about and reactivate it. Okay, here are some. I utilize very few pieces of equipment. I actually don't like to have to buy a lot of things to make food, but there are some things that I think are actually really important to have. So the first on the left is a digital scale. A digital scale makes you feel fancy, I'll tell you that. But what it does is it allows you to get a very predictable result with your bread dough every single time. So I know there's a lot of people, my grandma made bread dough by hand, like literally every week until the week she passed away. And she could just feel it. She just knew how much she was supposed to do because she was kneading it. She was feeling it. She didn't really measure it. I don't do it that often. And I'm going to show you, I don't need it. I'll give you that secret as well. So I like to use the digital scale. The way the digital scale works is you put your bowl, and I like the next picture over is the glass bowl. You can use any glass bowl, doesn't matter what one it is. You put the bowl on, and then you can see in that picture, there's a button that says tare. What that means is it's saying, don't pay attention to how much this bowl weighs, basically. So you push tare, and it's going to set it back to 0 again. So then you put in your ingredients. Let's say you add your flour, then you're gonna get it to the grams that are on the recipe, and you're gonna push tare again. Now it says, okay, we know the flour's right. Now we're going to tare again. Then we put the water into the right amount. Then we tare again. It's always going to set it back to 0 when you push tare, so that when you add your next ingredient, it will be accurate. Otherwise, you have to do a lot of math in your head. And sometimes I forget to do the math, and then I forget where I'm at, and I don't know how much I've added. So make sure you push tare in between adding each ingredient, Do you have to have the scale? Absolutely not. You can find a ton of recipes that use volume measurements. That's a cup, that's a tablespoon, that's a teaspoon. You can absolutely make recipes that way. I just know that as soon as I started using the scale, all of a sudden my bread started getting a lot more predictable. I started having a lot less failures because I wasn't relying on the feel, the touch, that sort of thing. It was just getting more accurate. You don't have to have it though. But I did find a really inexpensive one. We have a guide. This is the thing I was saving to the end, but we have a free guide that has a lot of this information in it. But I've also created an ebook and a video tutorial course that goes along with it that I walk through. Literally, my kitchen has been like a reality TV studio this week because every time we've done something, I'm like, stop, we have to record this. So we clear everything off the counter and we hurry and record it so that you can see all the steps and what they actually look like as we're going through this. And the ebook has a ton of recipes as well. Recipes for that starter that you removed, as well as recipes to make the starter into bread. So anyway, I do like the digital scale though. Like I said, the glass bowl, wooden spoon. I'm pretty sure somebody took a picture of this wooden spoon. That's not my picture, but that's my spoon. My spoon looks exactly like that. And then the other thing that I think is pretty important is this digital thermometer. I have pulled so much bread out of the oven in years past and cut it open only to find that it wasn't actually cooked inside. And it's so disappointing because it's so much work to get to that point. You don't want the last thing to be a disappointment. So bread should be cooked to 200 degrees. This bread should be cooked to 200 degrees internally. Anytime, I set my temperature on the oven, I let it go, my timer goes off, I pop this and my kids know. I'll say, hey, test the bread real quick, and they'll pop in the digital thermometer. They know how to do it too. And they know it's supposed to get to 200. They'll be like, it's like 5 degrees less. I said, all right, add 5 minutes. So I will not take the bread out of the oven until that registers 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Once it registers 200 degrees Fahrenheit, you are good to go. You can take it out. You can put it on a cooling rack. I'll tell you in a minute though, do not eat it right then. It continues to cook inside. The hot steam inside continues to cook the bread. So you cannot eat it for 30 minutes. It's like the longest 30 minutes of your life when you can smell hot bread in your kitchen and you can't eat it. But don't eat it for 30 minutes. It will continue cooking. So those are really the only implement that I use. That's the only things that I use to get fancy. I'll show you a few things as far as pans, but you can pretty much use anything for that as well. All right, ingredients. So this is it. This is all you use. And why are they special? There are a couple things that are special about it. So the water needs to be non-chlorinated water. Now, I didn't know this for years. I learned this a few years back from a friend. I had never thought about it. So what is the purpose for chlorine in the water? The purpose for chlorine is to kill microbes, to kill bugs in our water. This is to keep our water safer. Well, if we add chlorinated water to our sourdough, it's going to kill some of those yeasts. That's the purpose of chlorine. So you're not going to have as good of an effect with this if you use chlorinated water. Is it completely not going to work? Well, no, but you will have a better result if you use non-chlorinated water. Now, I have what's called a Berkey filter that I use all the time. That's what we use for all of our water. If you don't have something that filters the chlorine out, one simple way to do this is you just put the water in a container, let it be a pitcher. You leave it uncovered and leave it out overnight. What happens is chlorine is a gas. It will actually leave the water. It will off gas. That's why when you put chlorine in something, you keep it tightly closed because you don't want it to off gas. So if you leave that water out for 24 hours, it will off gas the chlorine and then you will have unchlorinated water. So again, think ahead a little bit, but just have, a container of water sitting there. And then you'll have unchlorinated water and it will just make your bread more effective. Flour. All right, this is a sticky one. Do we do white flour? Do we do wheat flour? That always is funny to me because white flour is wheat flour, right? It's been sifted. Typically the whole, the germ of the wheat has been removed and then some flour has been bleached. Why do they bleach it? Because it creates a finer texture to the flour. Well, for bread making, you actually don't want that finer texture flour. So your two choices are going to be unbleached baker's flour, which will still have the hole and that germ removed, but you're not going to have a lot of the problems that come with a bleached flour. That bleached flour, which is typically called all-purpose flour, actually doesn't work well for bread at all. You want a bigger you want a coarser texture for the glutens to be able to grab onto it and rise with. So you don't want that fine textured flour. It won't work very well. So that's what you want, an unbleached baker's flour, or you want a fresh whole grain flour. Let's talk about that a little bit because this can be problematic. Whole grain flours oxidize. So when you have a white flour, what they do is they remove the germ, which has a lot of the oils in it. So when you have a fresh whole grain flour that you've just ground, you have the oils still in it. Those oils, when they touch oxygen, remember they've been protected inside of that wheat kernel. When they touch oxygen, they oxidize, sometimes fairly quickly. And the nutrients in that can actually oxidize fairly quickly. It's just basically react with oxygen fairly quickly. So when you use a whole grain flour, you need to use a freshly ground whole grain flour. Otherwise, you're not going to have the nutrients that you're hoping to get out of that flour. So those are your two choices. And you will get more nutrients out of that whole grain flour. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You are going to get more nutrition out of that whole grain flour than you do the white unbleached baker's flour. It does have more in it. However, if you don't treat it right, it's going to be just the same as the white. What do I use? I use both. I use a little bit of both. Sometimes I use both of them in the same recipe. I have a beautiful white wheat unbleached flour that's just the most amazing flour ever. It's called West Mountain flour. If anyone's in Utah, you can't get it right now until May. They're completely sold out of this stuff. But it's a beautiful baker's flour. A lot of times I'll do both. I'll do some of the fresh ground wheat plus some of the baker's flour. Why do I do that? Because that West Mountain flour that I use makes the most amazing bread you've ever seen in your life. It gives more gluten. The bran and the germ of the wheat actually get in the way of gluten formation, gluten strand formation, and rising. So it's harder to get a good rise out of a whole grain bread than it is out of a white flour bread, interestingly enough. So sometimes I'll put both in to try to get the advantages of both. A little bit more nutrition out of the whole grain bread, a little more rise out of the white unbleached baker's flour. So that's basically the rules on flour. You get to choose what you want to do. Salt, make sure you use an unrefined salt, please. Sea salt is not as good. You do want a fairly fine grind on the salt, but I love real salt because it has minerals in it. So I'm adding nutrition just by adding the salt. Isn't that an interesting thing? Okay, let's talk about making this stuff. So I make it in a bowl and I use my hands. This picture is using a metal bowl. I would be using a glass bowl in this instance. But at the first you look at it, you think there's no way this is going to turn into a dough. There's no way. But you don't need a fancy mixer. If you have one, you can use it. But if you don't have one, you don't need it. I don't use one. I just use my hands in a bowl. And I start to just mix the stuff around, mix the flour, mix the water. Like I said, at first you're thinking there is no way this is going to turn into anything. Within about 3 or 4 minutes, all of a sudden, it's kind of starting to turn into this shaggy ball of stuff. There's flour on the outside. It's not really mixed in. So I keep kind of, this picture is perfect. I keep squeezing. I just kind of squeeze the flour into the dough, squeeze it. You know, it takes maybe 5 minutes at max. And I'm not using all my biceps. You know, I swear my grandma must have amazing biceps because she kneaded all of her bread and I knead for a few minutes. I'm like, oh my gosh, my arms are burning here. So my grandma must have been really strong. Actually, she was. But anyway, I'm not kneading here. I'm just like squeezing the dough and incorporating the flour into the starter and into the water, just getting everything mixed in. So you have kind of this shaggy mixture. I try to get all the loose flour. So there's no loose flour in the bowl. You get it all squeezed, incorporated into the dough. No loose flour. You kind of use your fingers around the outside. I always take off my rings before I do this because it gets full of, I remember my mom doing that forever, taking her rings off, setting them on the counter while she was working with the bread dough. I do the same now. So squeeze all the flour in. Then you're going to put a lid on this bowl and you're going to leave it for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, you're going to come back and you're going to be amazed at the transformation that's happened. It's not perfect yet, but it's already started to change. Already those gluten strands have started to form. So what you're going to do is you're going to fold it. And the way you fold it is you reach to the back of the bowl, you bring the dough forward, up and toward yourself. Then you're going to turn the bowl a quarter turn. You're going to reach to the back of the bowl, bring the dough up and toward yourself, turn the bowl a quarter turn, do it again, One more time, do it again. You're going to have something like this middle picture here. This one's been after a few folds, so it's quite smooth. At first, you're not going to look quite that smooth and beautiful, but after a little while, that's what it's going to look like when you fold it. That's all you're going to do. You're going to put the lid back on it. You're going to let it go for another 30 minutes. 30 minutes later, you're going to come back. You're going to fold it again. Remember, we're not kneading anything here. We're just folding. Literally, this takes 30 seconds. I'll tell my kids. I'll tell my daughter, go fold the bread, please. She'll run in. She'll fold the bread. She knows what that means. Puts the lid back on. So you do this 3 or 4 times every 30 minutes, and then you let it go for about an hour. Do it a couple times. Now, what do you do if you're not around? Believe me, I've had plenty of times that I'm not around. And so if you don't fold right on the half hour, right on the hour, it's okay. Life will go on and the bread will actually do fine. In fact, the bread that I used for the video tutorial, I just completely forgot about it. And I think I folded it twice the whole time, and it still worked fine. So fold it. The more you fold it, the better it's going to form, though, the better crumb that it's going to have. So you're going to fold every 30 minutes 4 times, every hour for a couple of times. Then what I do is I actually put that dough in the fridge. So typically I'm going to feed in the morning. I'm going to make the dough about early to mid-afternoon. And you know, when I'm working, this happens on Saturday, and then we cook it on Sunday. That, you know, it's just what happens. So about midday, I'm actually making the dough. We're folding it through the afternoon, then it goes in the fridge for the evening and the nighttime. What that does is it prolongs the fermentation period. So that's going to pre-digest more of that gluten. It's going to make it more tolerable for my digestive system. Does it make it more sour? No one that has ever eaten my bread would ever think that it was sourdough. That tang that you get from a commercial sourdough, they get that by adding vinegar. They don't actually make it through this method. They add vinegar to the dough because they think that's what you're looking for, is that tang. My bread does not taste that way at all. There's no tang to it. There's enough to make it delicious, but it does not taste sour at all. Leaving it overnight does not make this a more sour bread. You will find that nobody's going to say that this is a sour bread. Speaking of, that sour is just from what happens when the yeast digests the sugar. It actually puts an acid off as the byproduct to that digestion, and that's the acid that you're tasting. There's minimal in this kind of bread, especially if you make it the way I tell you to. So I let it rise overnight in the fridge, then I pull it out in the morning. Sometimes I let it come to room temperature. Sometimes I don't, because I don't have time, because I need to put it in the loaves right then. Can you tell that my life sometimes dictates the bread rather than vice versa? My bread doesn't dictate my life. I've even carried the bread in my car to the office before because I knew I needed to fold it a couple of times. I mean, just work it into your life. It works out. So I put it, either I let it warm up or I don't, and then I'm going to let it rise in the pans. So what kind of pan are you going to use? You have a few different choices. If you want to make a loaf bread, which is what we make every week. So every week we make, depends on who's living in our house. Right now, we're usually making 3 to 4 loaves a week, and we'll go through them just because it's coronavirus and we're all home and we're all, gaining bread weight. So why not? So we're eating a lot of bread. So we're making, 3 or 4 loaves a week right now. You can make them in a bread pan. That's a simple way to do it. I love my cast iron. I love my cast iron bread pans, actually. You can use any bread pan, though. It doesn't matter. There is a little bit better raise, depending. This picture in the middle shows the difference between a glass and a metal. I actually think it's less that and more the width. Can you see the width of the pan is different? It's a narrower pan on that glass pan. So it is important that the bread have something to push against as it's rising if you want to get a good rise. So make sure you have the right size pan for the dough that you have. So you're going to put it in a loaf pan, metal pan, glass pan, cast iron pan. I don't care what you use. I always use a little bit of coconut oil. And I know, and I think my mother is watching this, she hates to cook in my kitchen because I don't have Pam spray. So you can use Pam spray. You can use whatever you want on these pans. I use coconut oil, and you actually have to use a fairly thick layer of it to keep the bread from sticking. So whatever you want to grease your pan, you form your loaf, and it's really hard to describe how to form your loaf without doing it. The best way I have to describe it is you put your dough in your hands like this. If you can see my hands at all, put your dough in your hands, and then you're going to lift your fingers up and let the dough just fall down over the center of your hands. What that does is it allows the top of that dough to get very smooth. Now, the smoothness is good because that tension, again, is like that hot air balloon. So if you can create tension across the top of the loaf, the gas bubbles underneath are going to help it rise better. So again, I just kind of put my fingers under the center of the dough, let the dough fall over, and I do it again a couple times. You do it again from the other side, and you just let a smooth surface on the top happen. Tuck the ends, and then drop it into your loaf pan. I push down a little bit to spread it out a little bit in the pan, and then I let it go. If you see any giant bubbles that after you've done that, just pull them just a tiny bit and it'll just kind of pop that giant bubble. That way it doesn't leave a big air hole inside of your bread. So that's all you're going to do in a loaf pan. Now there are other options. You can make these beautiful artisanal loaves like you see on here. One great way to do it is to use an enameled covered pan that you'd cook, say, a roast or something like that in. Again, you don't raise it in the, you can raise it in the pan. Actually, that's a fine way to do it. You can also raise it in something called a banneton, which is a wicker former that you can use. You can also raise it in a bowl. It doesn't matter what you raise it in. Just make sure that if you have it in a bowl or the banneton, you put a little flour. I use rice flour because I don't want to use undigested wheat flour in my bread. So I use a little rice flour. And how do you get rice flour? You grind up rice in your blender, and that makes rice flour. So I just keep it in a little bag. You just spread a little thin layer of that, stick your bread upside down if you're doing it in a loaf, because what you're going to do is you're going to flip that bowl upside down on top of either one of these enamel or cast iron pans with a lid or a pizza stone. So there's ways to do it. Again, the book's going to explain a lot better than I'm explaining right now, but there's lots of different ways to cook this. If you're using a pizza stone, this one's learned from the hard knocks of life. Make sure you put that pizza stone in and preheat your oven an hour before you want to cook the bread. Otherwise, you're going to have a smoke-filled kitchen when you open that door and the pizza stone isn't hot enough. You put your bread on, it's just going to fill with smoke. So you will not get the smoke if you preheat that stone and that oven at least an hour up to the temperature. And you want it to be 500 degrees when you put your bread on it. You drop it down to 450, but you want it to be about 500 degrees. That's a hot stone. You're going to cook it till 200 degrees inside, like we said. Then you're going to let it sit. The hardest 30 minutes of your life, letting that bread sit. All right, so let's go through a daily bread recipe. We call this a daily bread because this is what we eat every single day. This is daily bread, and it is so incredibly simple. So again, like I said, there's going to be an ebook. There's going to be a video tutorial, all available. I wish I could give you the link right now, but unfortunately, I had a really busy day and it's not quite done yet. I just filmed 2 of the videos tonight before I did this. So it's going to be done tomorrow. We're all pushing hard to get it done tomorrow for you. So we'll send an email with all the links in it. But it really actually is a really good book because there's going to be a ton of good recipes in there, both the sourdough starter that you remove from the thing, as well as the sourdough starter you turn into bread. But here's the daily bread recipe I use. 1/2 cup of starter, 1 1/2 cups water, 3 cups of flour, and 1 1/4 teaspoon salt. How easy could that be? What you do is you follow the exact instructions that I already told you about. You're going to mix it all together. Remember, in a bowl with your hands, you're just going to mix it until it gets kind of shaggy. Then you're going to fold it like I talked about. You're going to, every 1/2 hour, you're going to fold, keep a lid on that, fold. Then you're going to let it sit overnight in the refrigerator so that you can get that longer ferment. In the morning, you're going to shape into the loaves. Doesn't matter what kind, whether you use it in a loaf pan or a banneton or a bowl or a Dutch oven. It doesn't matter what you use. If you use a Dutch oven or something of that sort, you do want a lid because the lid will trap the steam and the moisture and it will allow it to really raise and jump up and give you that really delicious crusty texture like you see on those nice round loaves. Let it rise again. And how high do you let it rise? So believe me, I've had lots of bread disasters, but none of them are disasters. They always work, and they just maybe don't look like I'd take a picture of it. They're not Instagram worthy as people call it nowadays. Some of them are certainly not Instagram worthy, but they're stomach worthy. They taste just fine. You only want to let it rise until it's about 1/2 inch above the top of your pan, because this bread actually has a pretty good oven spring. What that means is when it hits the temperature in the oven, the yeast will really quickly create gas, and you get a big rise right as soon as it hits that oven. So a couple of things I didn't describe, so I'm glad I'm going through this in my own mind. A couple of things. When I'm letting it rise, after I've put it into the loaf pan or the banneton or bowl, whatever it might be, you want to keep that covered with something, otherwise it'll get real crusty on top. So what I use, because I like to reuse everything, is I spray a little bit of liquid coconut oil. It could be Pam, it could be whatever you want, on the top of the loaf itself, just a little bit on the top. And then I cut gallon-sized Ziploc bags. I cut them apart, and then I cut off the zipper part of it. So I just have 2 sheets of plastic, if that makes sense. So I have the, the front side of the bag, the back side of the bag. I cut off the zipper and then I cut the front and back apart. So I just have 2 sheets of plastic. I stick those on top of the loaves as they're rising. I found that they're the perfect size to fit over 1 pan of bread. Now I used to use tea towels. I've used all kinds of things. And honestly, it was always so discouraging because these sometimes take a long time to rise. They take, 2 to 4 hours sometimes to rise. After 4 hours, you got a pretty dry, crusty top unless you've kept it moist. So a little bit of oil, something sprayed on the top of the loaf, stick this over top, this Ziploc bag cut in half over top, and let it rise. I reuse those bags all the time. So when I take the loaf pan out of the oven and take that plastic off, I just fold it inside so that the greasy side is on the inside. And that goes in my drawer, and then that's what I use next time. So I reuse a lot of this stuff. Once you've done that, you've removed the plastic off the top of the loaf. And if you've greased it, then it won't pull or tug or make problems with that loaf. Do it carefully so that the loaf doesn't deflate. But if you've risen it the right amount of time, it actually won't deflate. So it should only be about a ½ inch above the edge of the pans. If it goes too much, it's going to be real fragile. You've actually overused all of the food in that bread, and the yeast has created a lot of gas, but it's real fragile, and you probably will have your bread fall. So don't let it overrise unless you leave it, and then again, it tastes just fine, because I had that like 2 weeks ago. You want to actually make a slit in the top of the bread. And you've seen all the artisanal breads, how cute they are. Make these little slits, and you think that's just for decoration. But really what it is again, when that bread dough hits the oven, you're going to get that oven spring, an instant oven spring as that gas develops. And that gas has to go somewhere. And remember that parachute top, or that hot air balloon top is going to go up, but it sometimes the gas is more than can go up with that hot air balloon. So it will escape out somewhere. So it's going to find a weak seam. Oftentimes it'll kind of blow out the side of the bread if you don't give it a place to expand. So that's what that cut, or that slit in the top, use a very sharp knife and just cut right through the top of the bread. The faster you do it, the better. If you do it slow, it'll drag. Ask me how I know. So quickly cut across the top of that, and then it will give it a place to expand so that when it gets that oven spring, it's not going to blow out the sides of your bread. So that's what that's for. Excuse me. So the loaves, you're going to cook at 350 degrees for 45 minutes, or till 200 degrees inside. If you're cooking it in an enamel pan on a pizza stone, you're going to cook it actually at 450 degrees for more like 25 minutes. Again, all that stuff is in the recipe book. I didn't do an end slide this time. I didn't know I didn't. I've created too many PowerPoints this week. So that is the essence of making natural bread. I really wanted this webinar to be a lot about the whys, so that you are really convinced that you want to learn more about this and you want to try this at home. I also wanted to show you that it was so doable. It's flour, water, salt. That's all it is. It's nothing fancy. You don't have to have fancy equipment. You don't have to have a fancy mixer. You don't have to have a fancy anything. You can do this with just exactly what you have at home right now. Flour is important. Make sure you get the right kind of flour. Water is important. Make sure you off-gas that water a little bit. But this is so doable. Like I said, we have this ebook that has a lot of great information in it. I'm going to go to the chat now because I think that there's a few questions on there that I'm going to look at. I don't see anything on the Q&A, but I will look on this and make sure that I've covered these questions. So when do I put it in the fridge? It says got it now. So maybe they got it. Yeah, so it's if you are not going to be using that starter, once you feed it, if you're going to just be feeding it and then using it right then, go ahead and use it right then. Yes, if you have questions, go ahead and write them on the chat or the Q&A section, both. I'll look at both before we're done. So if you're going to be using it that day for something, then don't put it in the fridge. But if you're just feeding it to keep it active and alive, go ahead and throw it in the fridge. I had made so many things out of bread this last week that the last time I fed it, it went in the fridge. Because I'm like, if I leave that on the counter, I'm going to have to make something else in 4 hours. And we're like, have bread coming out of our ears right now. So I couldn't, so it went in the fridge. But tomorrow I'm going to use it. So I'll pull it out in the morning. And in fact, I might actually pull it out tonight and feed it tonight. And that way I can make pancakes out of it in the morning. But if I want to use it, then I pull it out and do it then. Okay, is distilled water okay to use? Or does it also have chlorine in it? Chlorine or distilled water should not have chlorine. Don't quote me on that because I'm not positive, but I think just by the nature of distilled water, it should not have chlorine in it. Does this work for making gluten-free bread using brown rice flour? My recipe is for brown rice flour. So the trouble is brown rice flour does not have gluten, which that's the whole reason you want it, right? Because you want a gluten-free bread. Well, gluten is the thing that makes those magical bubbles, that magical rise that we get, which is the big struggle with gluten-free bread. Believe me, I've made almost every version of gluten-free bread you can make. And it's difficult to get the same kind of texture as a non-gluten-free bread. It's going to be more like a quick bread, you know, like a banana bread, that sort of thing, a little denser texture and a lot less rise. It doesn't mean that you can't do it that way. You know, it's fine, but it just doesn't work as well. So could you use a natural yeast with rice flour? That's a great question that I don't know the answer to. Now I'm going to have to go research something else. As far as I know, it works with gluten. It works with a wheat flour because it has a simple sugar to digest. Rice should have a simple sugar as well. I will let you know that one. I don't know the answer to that one. That's a great question. Distilled water is sterile, nothing in it, exactly. So spring water does have minerals, but no chlorine. Excellent. Yep. And I like the minerals because it adds a little bit of mineral content to the bread as well. So it's just saying, you know, to use spring water rather than unchlorinated spring water rather than distilled water, just simply because there are some minerals in it. Is there any way to use gluten-free flour? So the exact same answer that I just said. That's a great question. I'm actually going to, I have seen nothing on that. And I think I've read 8 books on fermentation in the last week. So you can ask my family, they think I'm insane, which I am. I have seen 0 about gluten-free flour. So I'm so glad you asked because now I get to go research something else. Lots of people have asked that. 3 people have asked that. So we will find that out. But I want you to know, I'm not celiac. Okay. So I'm not going to talk for celiac people, but I am extremely gluten sensitive. As soon as I eat something gluten that has gluten in it, there's some restaurants that I cannot eat in because I immediately know. I know within 5 minutes or less, I know that there's been gluten in that. And I've had other people tell me this, but Cafe Rio here in Utah, I cannot eat there. And I have tried to leave so many things out. I mean, I literally tried to eat a salad with like nothing but lettuce in it, and I cannot. There's some gluten in there somewhere. So I am very, very sensitive to it. I can eat this bread. So I challenge you, if you're not celiac, if you're just sensitive, to give it a try and do a long ferment. The longer the ferment, the better it's going to be. Do you let it rise in the oven? So what I do for rising, it's called proofing, is I do because I have a proofing setting on my oven. So I put it in the oven and I let it proof in there. Proofing has a circulating air, keeps it at a constant temperature and keeps it just slightly warm. It's not like your oven temperature, it's just slightly warm. So that's why I let it rise in the oven. You don't have to. If you don't have a proofing setting on your oven, then don't let it rise in the oven. Let it rise just on your countertop. The warmer your kitchen is, the better the rise is going to be. So if it's real cold kitchen in the middle of the winter, you may be rising 6 to 8 hours before it's going to be completely up to temperature. Another thing you can do is you can rise it in the oven with just the oven light on, which warms it up just a little bit. Just make sure it doesn't get too hot. Sometimes it actually gets kind of hot. So you just don't want it to get too hot. If I have a dry starter to start from, did you say to use 1 tablespoon of it to start or all of it? Again, remember, the less yeast and the more food, the better it's going to be. So I would use a tablespoon and then add a 1/4 cup of flour and a 1/4 cup of water to it to activate that dry starter. Do I recommend einkorn flour over regular wheat flour? So that's a whole nother talk, but yes, einkorn flour is a non-hybridized wheat. It's an ancient wheat. Basically, the things that have changed as they've hybridized is they've doubled the genome. Every single time they hybridize wheat, they change the genetics of it. And so einkorn is an ancient wheat. It has a much simpler genetic profile. What I found, because I've actually made straight einkorn bread before, what I found is that it is a little finicky. The gluten takes longer to form, but it can work. It's expensive, but it can work. And so just give it a little more time. Just give it a little TLC, basically in all of the steps, give it a little more time to create that starter, give it a little more time to raise, give it a little more time to do all those kinds of things. How warm do I have to keep the starter? Should it be bubbly and growing? So you want it to be just basically room temperature at all times, unless you're not going to be using it. If you're not going to be using it, that's when you're going to put it in the fridge because it's going to slow down the growth of that. But it's going to be just room temperature is pretty much, it doesn't have to be warmer than that. I keep losing, there we go. Should it be bubbly and growing? Yes, it should be bubbly and growing when you're going to use it. So that's why you're going to remove some of the starter, go use it for something else, feed it before you use it in the bread recipe, because you want it to be bubbly and happy before you put it in the bread recipe. My kids will say that now. They're like, Mom, the starter's ready. It's really happy, because it's like literally last week, my daughter and I watched it ooze down the sides of the jar because it was growing literally in front of our eyes. It was crazy. You do want it to be bubbly and growing. What kind of flour is better for bread? Is soft white wheat okay to use? Have you used einkorn wheat? That's what I have. So again, einkorn wheat can work. You just have to spend a little more time. Soft white wheat works better for pastries. It doesn't have quite the same gluten formation as a hard white wheat. So I actually like hard white wheat. Hard red wheat is going to give you a little denser bread. It's not going to raise as well, but it has higher protein content. So all these things are give and take. I like hard white wheat. That's what I like to go for bread making. Did I say it takes a week to make a starter? Yes, if you're going to make it just from scratch. If you're just literally going to mix together flour and water and set it on the counter and see what grows, it's going to take about a week or so. I used to make rice waffles with sourdough. It was fabulous, crispier than wheat flour, and I liked it better. Sounds delicious. So rice waffles. So what I do when I make waffles is I use that starter that I took out, add a few things to it, add a little bit of olive oil, a little bit of salt, and then I actually put oatmeal in it. And that's what I use for my waffle recipe. In fact, I was just telling my daughter-in-law that's living with us now that's what I add to the waffles. And she said, there's oatmeal in there? She didn't have any idea. I said, yeah, every single time. Cultures for Health is a brown rice starter. Perfect. Okay, so people are helping us out here. So Cultures for Health is actually a great website. If you've never been on there, they have a brown rice starter. So it sounds like you can use a starter with brown rice flour. I'm gonna have to try this now. How important is getting organic wheat? This is a tricky one. So if you think about it, pesticides, herbicides are going to be on the outside of the grain. Well, if you are grinding that grain and turning it into flour and then soaking that and using it, you're using all of whatever was on the outside of that grain in your bread. So if it makes a difference, if you simply can't financially get the organic, then don't. But if you can, then organic's going to at least make it so you don't have the exposure to those pesticides and herbicides that you would if using a non-organic variety. I wish we didn't have to talk about that these days. How often do I feed my starter? So it's really dependent on how often you want to use it. So if you want to use it every other day, then you're going to feed it every other day. It's pretty much how often you know, if you're going to use it every third day, you're going to feed it every third day. If you're only going to use it every week, then you need to feed it every 3 days. So you're going to feed it, you're going to pull out some, you're going to feed it, then you're going to put it in your fridge and wait for it. So every 3 to 4 days is ideal. Now, can it go a week? Absolutely. Has mine gone a week? Mine's gone a month, and it still survived. But ideally, to keep it active and really doing well, you need to feed it every 3 or 4 days. To proof, you can use a camp cooler with a rice bag warmed up in the microwave. Love it. So what that's doing is just using, it's kind of like the thermal cooker idea. You can use a cooler, put your bread loaves inside of that, warm up something and close the lid. And now you've got a warmer environment for the bread to raise faster. How big is the jar that I store my starter in? It's a quart size. I have made it when I've been teaching classes and things. I have made it in a half-gallon size, which is great, but you never need that much. Like the recipe I use, even to make 4 loaves, a quart-size jar of starter is all you need. Because the same reason, I used to think that the more starter, the better in a recipe, but it's the same reason that you want to remove most of the starter before you feed it, is that the more yeasts that are in there, the more competition there is for the flour you've just given it. So you actually want less starter in your recipe, because then the yeasts in there are going to all have plenty of food in the flour you have. That's totally counterintuitive, but you really don't want a recipe that's heavy on the starter side, because you're not going to be able to add a lot of food to that. So I keep it in a quart and it's plenty. What was the mention or the website for the brown rice flour I just mentioned? It was actually it's called Cultures for Health, and that they say has a brown rice starter. So a starter specific for brown rice flour. Do I grind my oatmeal before adding to the starter? No, not when I'm making waffles. I just add it in whole and just add that straight whole. Okay, I'm going to stop the share on this because I need to look at Q&A, and I've now learned this is how I do it. How do you heat the water if you left it on the counter to get rid of the chlorine? I don't heat the water. I just use it at room temperature. So no water heating. I just use it at room temperature all the time. I can't eat Cafe Rio, somebody said. I can't either. I have no idea what's in there. If anybody works at Cafe Rio and knows their recipes, go ahead and let us know, but I can't eat there. Can you use instant yeast for a starter? You can, but I wouldn't, because, well, I take that back. You can do it. You're going to basically make your starter with the yeast that's in that yeast. Your yeast starter is going to change eventually based on your environmental yeasts. I don't like the yeasts that are in that rapid rise yeast because they're commercialized yeast, so I don't like them as well. So I would say just use it out of flour and water. Oh, look, someone says Cafe Rio has gluten in almost every item on the menu. Costa Vida is much more friendly. Exactly right. We eat Costa Vida. We can have a whole talk just on where to eat if you're gluten sensitive. Very good. Well, thank you all so much. I hope you got your questions answered. Like I said, there will be an email coming out tomorrow. Oh, we have one more quick. Is baker's yeast the same as sourdough starter? Yes and no. Baker's yeast is more, it's more the pasteurized yeast type. There's brewer's yeast, but brewer's yeast is specific for making beer. Sourdough starter it's a wild yeast. It's wild yeast that's based on where you live. So it's going to be different for every single person that's watching this. Every single person is going to have a different yeast colony in their starter based on where they live. So it's not one kind of yeast. It's multiple kinds of yeast. Can you use your Bosch mixer? Absolutely. But I kind of like mixing it and folding it. So it's just up to you. But you can use your Bosch mixer. Absolutely. I have a Bosch mixer. I just don't use it very often anymore, but you absolutely can use that. So again, thank you so much everyone for being on. I hope you've learned a thing or two. Hopefully this has excited you about natural yeast baking. And again, watch for the email that comes out that has has a free guide with the daily bread recipe on there, as well as information on the ebook with a ton of recipes and the video tutorial. Thank you all, and I hope you wish you happy baking.